Hello, Smart Community friends, and welcome to Mobility March. All of this month, we are talking all things mobility, which by now you probably know is one of my favorite topics. Now, in this episode of the Smart Community podcast, I have another great chat with Beate Kubitz, a transport consultant and future mobility researcher in the UK. I spoke with Beate in episode 194 about her cargo bike food delivery service in May of 2020 and was keen to chat with her further. In this episode, Beate gives us an update on the cargo bike delivery service and what's changed since we last spoke, and what their plans are for 2021. We also discuss the data that they are collecting on how many car journeys the cargo bike service is saving, which is so great to hear. Beate then tells us how she ended up in the smart mobility and transport space, and we discuss why it's so helpful and so important to have a range of different voices and different experiences in the smart community conversation. We talk about solving the wicked problem of reduced use of public transport and increased single occupancy car journeys due to social distancing, as well as the challenges of mobility and transport in regional and rural areas. We finish our chat discussing the problems with our current business models for public transport and the emerging trend of balancing the for-profit with community service transport options. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Hello, Beate. How are you today?
Great, thank you.
That is excellent to hear. I'm so excited to have you back on the podcast. And we were just working out when we spoke last, and it was in May 2020, which just seems like an absolute lifetime ago.
It does, yes. May 2020. We'd had about, 2 months of lockdown in May, and I started a rural e-cargo bike delivery service as a lockdown project. So we're fast forward to December. What's that? Another, 7 months? It's getting hard to count these days, isn't it? So in 7 months, the lockdown project got a bit of funding, got 3 months funding so that it expanded to 3 towns in rural West Yorkshire. Made about 1,500 deliveries. And so we've consulted because it was run entirely by volunteers. Or, the riders were all volunteers. And most of everyone was volunteer, but we had one person being paid out this funding to do the coordination because it was hard to do that and do other smart transport things. So Anthony ran it, organised all the deliveries and things, and training for volunteer riders. So I think we were up to about 16 volunteer riders. And then we talked to them at the end of the funding, and they were all kind of keen to continue as a mix of volunteers and paid staff where possible, because we've now got some rounds where they work financially. We're being paid by shops to do deliveries. So we've got some paid shifts and some voluntary shifts. We've got a cargo bike, a community interest company, which is a UK structure for being a company that isn't purely concerned about shareholders and profit. It's a community benefit organisation. Obviously, you can't make a loss, but that's now kind of like, it's a good vehicle for having this kind of like, we just want to do something and we're not, some people want to do it because they believe passionately in it, and other people, need a job. So it's kind of good, better mixed model potentially.
That's awesome. I guess I just will stop you there because I know some people might not have listened to that podcast. So let's do firstly, 101 on you. Tell us who you are. And then let's do a very brief overview of what we talked about in May. So Tell us who you are.
Okay.
Tell us about your background and tell us what you're passionate about.
Okay. My name is Beate Kubitz. I'm an independent reader, writer, researcher, consultant in smart mobility, new mobility. I'm kind of one of those people that sees a lot of a lot of things and the connections between things rather than being an expert on trains or buses particularly. I'm more into the way that you connect together new mobility like bike share and car clubs and scooters potentially, sharing rides, demand responsive transport, all of those things that kind of fill in the gaps between the major public transport modes and the digitisation of that. So that's kind of what I do. In the kind of crazy pandemic times, I have also run a e-cargo bike delivery service in the place that I live, which is a semi-rural town in West Yorkshire. So kind of proving a bit of the case for electric cargo bikes outside of city centres, which has been quite good fun. And I mean, I think that that's really kind of encapsulates what I do. I'm passionate about transport becoming sustainable, decarbonising it, making our air quality better and making our quality of lives better through being able to move, but in a more sustainable way. So yes, that's where I'm coming from.
Absolutely. And yeah, so in May of this year, I think I found you on LinkedIn and you were just starting out with the cargo bike. And yeah, we just had a great chat about, and of course it was, times where we were most of the world was locked down. And so just reaching out. And so you can go and have a listen to that. That's on YouTube, but also we re-released it on the podcast in October this year as well. So if people haven't listened, go and have a listen to that to get the first part of the story. But the second part of the story, what we decided was we need to have more conversation about what smart mobility means and how that fits into smart communities, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's been really great to hear a bit of an update on where you are at with the cargo bike and what are the plans for 2021 with the bike going forward? Or the bikes, more than one, right? How many have you got now in the fleet?
So we've got 4 bikes in total. We've got one in Halifax, which is a town of 80,000 people that serves the market. And we have this really amazing building called the Peace Hall, which is multiple shops within a 18th century enclosed courtyard. It's amazing. It's an absolutely gorgeous building. Wow. One of the best places to visit should you be in West Yorkshire. Visit Halifax Peace Hall and visit the Borough Market as well. That's a lovely Victorian building with lots of little shops and markets within it. So yeah, so that's one there which goes out and does veg boxes and various bits and bobs on a Thursday. One in Hebden Bridge, which is a much smaller place, 5,000 people in Hebden Bridge. We do veg boxes on Tuesdays in Hebden Bridge. We do 50 plus veg boxes in a day. And what's really interesting is that that's actually faster than a van can do it. So it's a really interesting that small town can have a sustainable delivery service and it completely works. And then we also have 2 bikes in my hometown of Tottleton doing deliveries for various different organisations, from the food bank to the whole food shop. So yeah, so that's, we've got a little spare bike there as well. So sometimes we shuffle them around because actually you find that people want to move things from one of these towns to the other of these towns. So we'll kind of like on busy days, we'll use one bike to shift thing to help the other bike. And then it's kind of really interesting because you sort of see these sort of like connections developing just through logistics and delivery. That's quite exciting.
Yeah. And I'm thinking we talked last time about data. You're collecting a lot of data. Have you managed to do anything exciting with the data yet?
Oh, I don't know about exciting. At the moment, it's just a case of looking at quite how many journeys we've managed to avoid, car journeys we've managed to avoid. And looking at, there's a cooperative that does food, all sorts of food, meat, veg, baking, all sorts of things. And we looked at their figures and showed them they have customers who live, I think their customer demographic is people who live at the ends of lanes entirely. And they're really small lanes as well. So, if you don't really want to be sending vans up them because they can destroy the surface of the lane pretty quickly. So that was quite interesting. We started looking at their figures, and if all their customers collected in their inevitably 4x4s because they live at the ends of lanes, then, we just by doing their rounds on a cargo bike, we're saving between half a ton and a ton of carbon dioxide a year. And so that's, just quite interesting, just looking at the movement patterns and data there. So yeah, so that's pretty interesting. And then obviously the much more dense small towns. It's kind of like crazy when you think of dense, you think of cities, but we're doing 50 drops within a mile and a half of a shop in a small town. So that's completely viable on a similar scale to a city cargo bike delivery service, which is interesting. And it's about local shopping and all of those. You really would not want a car carrying those things into tiny cobbled streets and things like some pretty steep hills. That's been quite interesting, quite how steep some of the hills are. And so the things that we're kind of developing are, how do we project how far we can go in a delivery round and things like that. And so we're looking at some digital tools at the moment to assist the cargo bike deliveries. So that's quite exciting. That there's like spin-off projects and exciting things coming out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So interesting. I want to go back a little bit and ask you how you ended up in this smart mobility space. Where did that kind of stem from for you?
So I completely serendipitously, I ended up, I moved to Yorkshire 18 years ago. Gosh, that's a long time. And I ran my own business for a while, but it was in retail, and retail is really difficult. And suddenly I thought, no, this is crazy. You need a job. And so having run an ethical knitwear business, what do you do? And also prior to that, all my jobs were in sort of like national and international organisations in London. And there's organisations advertising in Leeds, which is, the nearest West Yorkshire city. And it was Car Plus, which is the umbrella group for car clubs. It's now Como UK and is much more broader than car clubs. So that was a kind of like great job because it enabled me to learn lots about car clubs and to start looking at all the trends that were happening. Because when I joined Car Plus, as it was then, it was the moment we were just seeing this sort of emergence of Uber. Things like the small car clubs had been set up as kind of social enterprises and community groups, but they were beginning to be spotted and bought out by car hire at the time. Avis bought Zipcar, for instance. And so we were kind of like seeing that something that was quite a niche consumer, a niche kind of community project type organisation was suddenly becoming of interest to the automotive industry in its sort of various forms. And that was a pretty interesting time. We also established some bike share trials in the UK and have been looking at lift sharing in its various forms. So from people car sharing private vehicles right the way through to combining lifts into minibuses and demand responsive transport. So yes, so that was a great job. And then suddenly, as happens with many small voluntary organisations, it ran out of money. And I was suddenly without a great job. So I've basically been an independent consultant for over 3 years now, just because people just approached me with projects from the moment that I was unemployed, and I've not really got round to looking for a paid employment
You're self-employed, yes.
I'm self-employed, yes. Yes, I'm very grateful to my clients who pay me, but yes, I've not worked for an organisation in a role like that for some time now. So yeah, it's an interesting thing because I wasn't trained in this, and it's been a case of it's a very new discipline, so it needs that kind of open thinking, I think, of being really prepared to explore things and do the analysis and work out trends rather than having that sort of narrow dive. There are a lot of people who know a lot about trains and buses and whose expertise is absolutely, bang on. But it's being able to see how that knowledge connects with other bits of social trends and environmental needs and digital developments is my contribution to smart cities.
It's so awesome. I was thinking while you were talking, been thinking a lot and doing some work in the space of how we bring creatives into this smart city, smart community space, like people from different background. Like when you were talking about being in retail, like you think about the cargo bike, essentially you needed a bit of that retail mind, right, to be able to do this. And so if you didn't have that, if you were maybe, trained as an engineer or a transport planner or something like that, maybe you wouldn't have been able to branch out so much because, yeah, like you said, you may have been, oh, well, this is my discipline, this is how I do it. And I think sometimes we fall into those, oh, well, this is how I do it or whatever, and we don't even realize. But because you were coming at it from such a different angle, you were able to, and then, learn about, like, with the cars and all that new stuff that was happening. Yeah, I think it's really kind of a magic thing, not magic because it's real, but it's exciting that kind of has all come together. And in this space, there's so many stories like that. And that's what I really love to hear, because as much as I'm an engineer or whatever, but what makes, things light up and what excites me is when I can bring in those other bits that don't really fit into traditional engineering per se. And I really think that's where the smart community thing, it's like an everybody thing, because it needs to have those different elements to it. And I want more people to jump into the convo, because otherwise, yeah, you only get much of the same of the same. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is that's awesome. I love it. Love it.
It's really interesting. It is really, it's all needed. That's the problem. You have to know. You can't run a bus service without knowing, about health and safety and knowing, about drivers, shift rates and working time directives and all of those things. You cannot do that without all of those things. But yes, the danger of knowing things in a really deep way is that you then don't connect them back together. And I think that what you're saying about retail is very interesting, because when I was working in my retail business, I spent a lot of time trying to work out how high streets even work, because it's really tough. And part of the COVID experience is that there are a lot of high street retailers in the UK that have just absolutely crumbled. And I think that there's a sea change in the business model that is coming, and it's sort of like a little bit like the sea change in transport. We're going to see a lot of changes in the near future, I think, and that is one of the things that it's hard to adapt for, and that's where you need that kind of, like, even if it's wrong, you need to be able to think of different scenarios and alternatives just to game them out. It's very interesting. At the moment, I'm doing some work for I got a foundation, which was an amazing thing to happen, a fellowship from the Foundation for Integrated Transport. And
congratulations.
Thank you. I'm astonished and really, quite humbled and proud at the same time, kind of like, wow, But the thing is that what I've been thinking about is that we're very good at looking at city centres in transport and the big projects, the public transport, particularly in public transport. So we're very good at looking at public transport in city centres and making that great. And that's good. But we've kind of not really understood that cities are not necessarily dense all the way. Well, they're just not dense all the way through. It's there's something about the kind of structure of the greater urban area that doesn't mean that you can apply the same models right the way across. So, and in the other direction, Leeds is my closest West Yorkshire city. Manchester is my closest, not West Yorkshire city, it's actually a little bit closer. And it's a greater urban area of about 2.8 million people. So people talk about Manchester as like this enormous 2.8 million people city. But actually living within the dense bit of Manchester, the city centre, the borough that called itself Manchester, is about 600,000. Those people have great public transport. They have, someone cleverly mapped the accessibility, the distance that people are from trains and buses and metros and things in Greater Manchester and all the options they've got in Manchester city centre. And it's, it's kind of like the highest level that you can get. And that's great. But then there are 9 other boroughs, and those boroughs they are not mapped in the same way. And that's kind of like, well, okay, they're all their own boroughs, and that maybe you'll get some cars, sort of, you'll get higher car traffic as a result of that. Yeah, I mean that's kind of obvious, but also they contribute an awful lot of traffic into central Manchester, because every journey has both an origin and a destination. So if you don't have good transport at your origin, you get in your car. So the work that I'm doing at the moment is kind of looking at what is the solution. You will never solve the traffic problem in central Manchester unless you solve the public transport problems in outer boroughs and beyond those outer boroughs. So yeah, I'm just looking at car flows, and the thing with COVID that we're seeing is people kind of thinking about, do they want to live in city centres? Do they want a bit more space maybe? And if we get people moving out, we're going to exacerbate this problem even more unless you solve that public transport issue. And it's one that's replicated all over. I don't know about Australia, but Luxembourg, for instance, free public transport in the whole of Luxembourg, yay. But Luxembourg is an extremely rich country. It's very expensive to live in Luxembourg. A lot of people work in Luxembourg but live outside Luxembourg. They don't benefit from the free public transport, so they drive in. And the streets are also crowded. I mean, it's, but you've got the same in Paris. You've got wonderful 15-minute city plans in central Paris, but then you've got the suburbs and the outside the peripherique, and people want to drive in because they don't have the same kind of public transport that they have in the city centre. So, I can't say that I'm going to ever find a solution, or there is even one solution, but it's looking for how do we balance that out? What's the equity? How do you make it work for everyone?
Yeah, I'm just nodding along, which no one can see on the podcast, obviously. But yeah, no, it's such an important issue, and I think it's something we don't talk about enough. And it was, a little bit of the work that I did when I was doing my Churchill Fellowship was like looking at, people like, oh, tell me about micromobility, tell me about this, tell me about that. But then I was like, well, yeah, scooters or whatever are great in the city centre, but it doesn't connect into the regional people. And so they're on, like in Mexico, for example, they're on these very unsafe minibus taxi things and that are unregulated, but that's how they're only option to get in. And then, it's a really complex issue. And in Australia, we definitely have, those exacerbate, particularly in regions. It's like public transport, what's that, and we do have buses here in Toowoomba, but it's definitely a complex issue that if you can find the solutions,
It goes back to markets as well. It goes back to density of markets. So a lot of, if you're bringing you had a great idea for, hoverboards or whatever, you don't start them off in a rural area because you don't have the density of market. So, if you start them off in a city, you've got all of those people to attract to your new mobility product. And that's fantastic. So you get a good idea. You can try it out with lots of people. Do they fall off? Whatever your question about your business model is, you can kind of answer it in a city. Well, the perception is you can answer it in a city centre. And then as soon as you get out into the rural areas, there are a few people to try it out. So you're not going to make money out of it because the cost benefit ratios are not necessarily the same in any way, shape or form because you've got a higher infrastructure cost. So you kind of end up in cities trying out lots and lots of amazing new mobility things and, maybe proving the case for the city centre, but that just exacerbates the transport divide with the more rural areas, and not even rural areas, suburban areas with just slightly lower density of habitation. And it kind of, it's a really interesting question because it's kind of about social equity as well as pure transport. And about people's perceptions of where they want to live. And, there's a different types of people. I live in a rural area, not because I don't want to live near transport systems. I actually do. I live within 500 metres of the train station. Hooray. But I ride a bike and I like to ride straight out into the countryside. And that's what I want to do. So it's kind of, you see the different kind of people's different life expectations all colliding with transport, and not just where they live, the transport where they live, but also the transport in the places that you go to. It's fascinating. I don't think there are any permanent answers or anything. It's just things that we need to look at and address and be a bit more agile about working on.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's going to be really interesting. And I know it's, this isn't new news really, but now after COVID, it's remote working, what's that going to do for the commute and how the tolerance of people's commutes? And will it be a social equity issue if I can't work remotely or something along those lines? It's going to be these really interesting conversations of why can't this be remote, which will be so fascinating. I mean, it's already starting to happen, even in conversations that I've had, and just the willingness to open up to be remote for things that can be, and then, enriching that face-to-face experience when, it's like, oh, well, I'm going to see this person once this month, so that's going to be a nice experience or whatever. But
make it good then.
yeah, make it good. Let's have drinks. Let's do this. It's going to be great. Even in, personal and professional sense, I suppose, as well. Like, clients are definitely much more open to remote when, before, particularly in regional Australia, it's hard to engage remotely because also connectivity issues as well, which, may have just been one time that we couldn't connect to Zoom, but that can really damage people's, I guess, want or desire to use remote technology because it didn't work, it hasn't worked, whatever.
That's really interesting because we have also the opposite problem. I live in the north. A lot of the meetings that I have been going to prior to COVID were in the south, in London primarily. And the assumption is very much that, it's an important meeting, it'll be in London. Whereas COVID has been a great leveller because everybody's been on Zoom. Prior to this, I've been kind of like taking 7 hours to, round trip to go to a meeting or speak at a conference, or where, everyone else has kind of maybe come from much more, central to London. So it's kind of, this COVID's been a really good leveller for saying, right, okay, I want my northern voice is in the room without having to, make a 250-mile journey there, and then the same again back again. So it's and then the other issue is like prior to COVID, if I was making that 250-mile journey and the trains broke, then I wasn't in the room to start with. So there's a kind of like, there's both connectivity parallels and transport parallels. And I think it's been really interesting as this period for not prioritising London in terms of, that's been the issue has been that you can be anywhere. You could be in Paris if you wanted, or you could be in the Highlands of Scotland. And yes, connectivity can be an issue, but it's in a lot of ways, it's less of a problem than a very long journey.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I have had similar experience where, you can do coffee chats, which virtually, whereas it was possible before. And because the other way, I live in Toowoomba and I would go to Brisbane quite a lot. And I have started to go back for important meetings, or not even important meetings, kind of like social things, actually, when there's something tagged on the end, because I feel like even me just saying, important meeting, it was like, well, why is it? It's not less important if I'm zooming in, like I'm still there. Like it's not that me being there in person is prioritizing that meeting or something like that. But I think that's what we have in our head, this unconscious bias that we didn't realize before. It was like when you're remoting in, you weren't as valued or something. I don't know. I'm still trying to work it out. But there's definitely some kind of, that perception that digital was seen as less than or remote was seen as less than. Whereas now, like you said, it has leveled if you have that strong connection, or you can make it some other way. So it's been fascinating, and like I did a lot of thinking about it pre-COVID, or not pre-COVID, but in that first kind of stage. Whereas now, I think I'm just very tired. But anyway, coming back to thinking about it again for 2021.
So I think that this great levelling and the digitising, I think that's never going to completely go away. We're not going to go back to travelling as much as we have done. And that's going to have a really interesting impact on transport because, at the moment, we're seeing incredibly low levels of use of public transport in the UK at the moment because you've been actively advised not to. We're seeing, interestingly, shared car journeys seem to be a pretty unsafe thing to do in the COVID context. So that's been a kind of, people have switched to sharing cars, and that's actually not been less safe, I suspect, than public transport. But that's a second, the safety aspects with COVID will even out eventually because we do have a vaccine on the horizon. But what we don't have is, I don't think we're going to have the same density of use of public transport that we have had in the past. I mean, the really crammed tubes, the really crammed commuter buses and trains. And that's going to be a massive issue. This is going to become, we've had in the UK a pretty deregulated bus service and trains that run on franchises. And the money that is made in transport, where it's made in transport, not everywhere, it's not made in rural areas, is made on those high density fast corridors. And we've kind of let this issue arise whereby, if you have a bus that runs along a corridor, it will have 90 people on it in peak hours. That's great. That makes money. So that off peak, when it's got 3 people and who will have senior passes, the profit from the 90 people in the peak hours will cover that. But if we don't have those peak hours, this is going to be a really kind of big question for transport in 2021, is if we've got this kind of slightly lower level where you don't absolutely maximize your profits in the peaks, what's transport going to look like, and what are our timetables going to look like? What's the business model going to look like? And that is quite a big question. I mean, one of the sort of like problems that I see with rural transport in general, and this is partly why I'm doing this fellowship or the work on the fellowship, is that there's always been a bit of a problem where our corridor-based bus routes are run for profit by companies with shareholders. They have to turn a profit. They can't be philanthropic about it, because that's not their job. But then we know the local councils, local authorities know that there are lots of communities that need to be connected to those corridors and to each other in smaller rural buses and suburban buses. So they subsidise the rural buses, which is great. They still exist. People can travel. But when you look at that as economically, effectively, they are feeding the bus and train networks which are run for profit. And we just have not kind of worked that one out in the UK, that you publicly fund loss-making services, which is a social good, and that boosts the profits of profit-making services, which is an economic issue good. So I think that there could be quite a bit of rethinking in the new year when we kind of have less dense, the normally what we would expect to be profitable networks, as well as community funded networks. And I mean, at the moment, everything is practically being run by the government, which is quite interesting. It's been kind of like emergency nationalisation almost. There's a lot of change coming, and we need to be kind of careful about how we think about it.
It's so great to chat with you, Beate. I haven't asked you any questions at all, really, but it's been great to chat, and I have really enjoyed getting this update from you, and I really feel like we should have another chat later on, maybe 2021. This will go out actually in 2021. But I just want to ask you rapid fire. I've got a couple of questions that I like to ask everybody. So let's do some rapid fire. What are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
I think that this kind of like realization that we're going to have to balance out profit and, for-profit transport with the kind of more community and publicly subsidized profit. I think that's going to kind of become critical. That kind of urban-rural split is going to be more considered in the future. And the impact of suburban and peri-urban transport on city centres. I think that, city centres are doing great at kind of becoming smarter, and they've got there's lots of clever things happening, trying to make the 15-minute city and all of these things. But you can fix that as much as you like, and that's great that you are, but without kind of fixing the broader transport network to enable people to not have to drive into those cities from areas that are less well connected, it's never going to wholly work. So I think that's going to, the more we fix in the city centres, the more we'll see that there's still an issue and wonder why that's happening.
Well, it's been so great to chat with you, and thanks so much for getting up early and just having this conversation. It's been really great.
It's been cool. Thank you.
Okay, one more question. How can people connect with you?
Oh, I have a website, which is justmyname.com. So there's a form on there. So if you can't remember my email or Twitter or anything, it's kind of on there. So that's beatekubitz.com. I'm also just on Twitter as Beate Kubitz, and LinkedIn as well. So pretty easy to get in touch with, and happy to chat.
Excellent. We'll put those links in the show notes and people can click away and find you. And next time we chat, it'll be 2021.
Cool. Excellent. All right. Lovely to speak to you. Thank you.
Too. We'll talk soon. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Are you looking for an engaging speaker, MC or facilitator for your next big event? Then we've got you covered. Zoe is a go-to speaker, MC and conversation facilitator with a difference. She's a master at simplifying the complex and making connections you might never see. Book Zoe for your next event. Email hello@mysmart.community or head over to her speaker page, www.mysmart.community/speaking.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.